The sun dipped low over the village of St. Mary Mead, casting a golden sheen across the pristine lawns of Rose Cottage. It was the day of the annual garden fete, a tradition as enduring as the cobblestone paths weaving through the hamlet. Sis clambered up trellises in fragrant profusion. Bees droned lazily, and the air hummed with the chatter of villagers. Tables strewn across the grass groaned under the weight of scones, jams, and towering Victoria sponges, while a small brass band struck up a lively tune near the vicarage hedge. To an outsider, it was the epitome of English serenity, tea, but to Miss Jane Marple, knitting quietly beneath the shade of a yew tree, it was a stage set for subtle dramas. Her sharp blue eyes swept the scene, her needles clicking in steady rhythm. Dressed in a simple lavender frock and her customary straw hat, adorned with a single silk flower, she was an unassuming figure amid the bustle. Around her, villagers mingled. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, the plump, rosy-cheeked widow who owned Rose Cottage, flitted among guests with a tray of lemonade. Dr. Philip Grayson, the young new physician, tugged nervously at his tie while chatting with the vicar's wife. Mr. Leonard Price, a dear retired solicitor, stood apart, nursing a glass of sherry and scowling at the festivities. Miss Marple noted it all, the tightening of Mrs. Henshaw's smile as Dr. Grayson passed, the faint tremor in Mr. Price's hand as he sipped his drink. People, she mused, were rarely what they seemed, and a village fete was as fine a setting as any for their hidden tensions to simmer. The afternoon unfolded pleasantly until a piercing scream shattered the music. Teacups froze midair, heads turned. The cry had come from the rose arbor at the garden's far end, a shaded nook where Mrs. Henshaw displayed her prized blooms. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression calm but alert, and joined the gathering crowd. Peering over shoulders, she saw the cause of the commotion. There, among the roses, lay a woman, quite dead. Her pale blue dress was crumpled, her hands clawing at the earth as if she tried to drag herself away. A thin trickle of blood stained the soil beneath her head, and her wide, unseeing eyes stared skyward. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. "It's Ellen Ward." Someone gasped. Ellen, the quiet seamstress from a modest cottage on the village's edge, was an unlikely candidate for such a grim fate. She had arrived alone, her mousy brown hair tucked beneath a plain bonnet, speaking to few. Yet here she lay, her life extinguished amid the celebration. Dr. Grayson knelt beside her, his face pale as he checked her pulse. "She's gone," he said hoarsely, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. "A blow to the head, I'd say. We'd better fetch Inspector Craddock." The band fell silent, and the fete dissolved into disarray. Women clutched their shawls, men muttered grimly, and children were hustled indoors. Miss Marple lingered near the arbor, her gaze drifting from Ellen's still form to the crushed roses beside her. A single petal, torn and smudged with a faint reddish-brown mark, caught her eye. She bent to inspect it, careful not to touch, then straightened with a thoughtful hum. "Poor dear," she murmured, as if commenting on a spilled teapot rather than a murder. "I wonder what she saw in those roses." Inspector Craddock arrived soon after, a lean man with a clipped mustache and a no-nonsense air. He surveyed the scene, barking orders to his constable, who roped off the arbor. "Right then," Craddock said, addressing the small cluster of witnesses. "Who saw what?" "Let's have it." Mrs. Henshaw dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "I can't believe it. Ellen, of all people. She was here not an hour ago, admiring my roses. Said they reminded her of her mother's garden." Her voice trembled, though Miss Marple noted the steadiness of her hands as she spoke. "She didn't seem herself today," Dr. Grayson offered, his brow furrowed, nervous, jumpy, kept glancing over her shoulder. I thought she might be unwell. Mr. Price snorted, his thin lips curling. Nonsense. Ellen Ward was a meddler, always poking her nose where it didn't belong. Probably crossed the wrong person. God. He shot a sidelong glance at Dr. Grayson, who flushed and looked away. Craddock scribbled in his notebook. Stint turned to Miss Marple, who stood quietly to one side. And you, Miss Marple, anything to add? She smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling. Oh, I'm just an old woman who enjoys her knitting, Inspector. But I did notice Ellen seemed rather distracted when she arrived. She kept clutching her reticule, as though afraid to let it go. Perhaps it's nothing. Her tone was mild, almost apologetic, but Craddock knew better than to dismiss her outright. As the inspector moved off to question others, Miss Marple returned to her seat beneath the yew tree, retrieving her needles. The village would buzz with this for weeks, she knew. Rumors would bloom like the roses around poor Ellen's body, and somewhere in that tangle of whispers and half-truths, she thought, lay the key to what had really happened. Okay, for now, she would listen. People always revealed more than they intended, especially when they thought no one important was watching. Chapter 2. The village reacts by the next morning. News of Ellen Ward's death had spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire through dry grass. Every doorstep and tea shop thrummed with hushed voices and knowing glances. The garden fete, meant to be a summer highlight, had become a grim milestone, destined to be recounted in lower tones for years to come. Rose Cottage, the roses still bloomed, but their beauty now carried a faintly macabre, as though they'd borne witness to something unspeakable. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlor of her neat little cottage, a cup of tea cooling beside her as she worked. On her knitting through the open window drifted snatches of conversation from the lane outside, where villagers lingered longer than necessary on their morning errands. She listened, her hands moving steadily, her mind sifting through the fragments. Like a prospector panning for gold in the post office, Mrs. Daisy Bantry, the Colonna's wife, and an incurable gossip held court. I always said Ellen Ward was a queer one, she declared, adjusting her hat with a flourish, living all alone in thought pokey. Cottage, sewing day and night, mark my words, she'd gotten herself mixed up in something shady. Why else would anyone bash her head in like that? The postmistress, Miss Finch, nodded sagely, though her eyes gleamed with the thrill of scandal. Across the street at the Bluebird, in Mr. Leonard Price sat nursing a pint, his bony fingers tapping the table. Shady, my foot, he muttered to the barman, who was polishing glasses with exaggerated care. Ellen was a busybody, probably saw something she shouldn't. Have something to do with that new doctor, if you ask me to smooth by half. That Grayson, his voice carried a bitter edge, and the barman raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Meanwhile, Mrs. Clara Henshaw had taken to her bed at Rose Cottage, claiming a nervous collapse. Her made a wiry girl named Lella relay the news to anyone who'd listen. She's proper shook up, man, is Lily Sado, the vicar's wife, Skizza Clement, as they met near the church gate, keep saying it's her fault for hosting the fete, that Ellen still be alive if she hadn't command. She won't touch the roses no more, says they give her the creeps. Mrs. Clement clucked sympathetically, though her mind was already turning over the possibilities. Miss Marple absorbed her expression, placid as she looped yarn over her needles. She knew well how a village worked, how fear and curiosity churned up the past, spilling secrets like tea leaves from a pot. Ellen Ward had been a quiet soul, a spinster of 40-odd years who took in minting and made dresses for the local girls, hardly the type to inspire murder, one might think, and yet miss. Right. Marple reflected, it was often the quiet ones who stumbled into the deepest waters. her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Dolly. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Jane, you'll never guess what I've just heard," she exclaimed, sweeping into the parlor without waiting for an invitation. "They're saying Ellen Ward wasn't just killed, she was haunted. Lee swears she saw a figure in a gray cloak lurking near Rose Cottage the night before the fete." "A ghost, Jane, can you imagine?" Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap and offered a small, indulgent smile. "A ghost, Dolly? How very dramatic, though. I suppose Lily's young eyes might see all sorts of things in the twilight." "Did she say anything else, Dolly?" Perched on the edge of a chair, barely containing herself, only that it vanished when she called out, just melted into the hedge. "Tage, and now half the village is saying Ellen's death is some sort of curse. You know how superstitious people get. But honestly, Jane, what do you make of Vito?" "I don't know about curses," Miss Marple said, mildly pouring Dolly a cup of tea. "But it's curious, isn't it? How quickly a story grows legs. I dare say Ellen's death has stirred up more than just ghosts. People do love a good tale. She handed Dolly the cup, her eyes twinkling faintly. "Tell me, what does Colonel Bantry think?" Dolly waved a hand. "Oh, he says it's all nonsense. Probably some poacher or who got startled and lashed out. But I say, there's more to it. Ellen wasn't the sort to tangle with tramps. She barely left her cottage except for church and the odd errand." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. "Yes, she did keep to herself, didn't she? Which makes one wonder why she came to the fete at all. It wasn't her usual habit." She sipped her tea, letting the thought hang in the air. "Okay." Dolly frowned, then brightened. "You're right, Jane. That is odd. Perhaps she was meeting someone or hiding from them." She leaned forward, conspiratorial. "What if this ghost business is a cover for something else? Something real, perhaps?" Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as ever. "Perhaps it's just the village doing what villages don't make in mountains out of mole hills. We shall see what Inspector Craddock turns up, I expect." Dolly chattered on for a while longer, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. A grey-cloaked figure, a nervous seamstress, a bloodied rose petal. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but they were beginning to form a pattern. She thought of Ellen's reticule, the way her fingers had gripped it so tightly. Had it been found with her body, she made a mental note to ask Croquin next. She saw him as Dolly took her leave, promising to report any fresh rumors. Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The village would keep talking, and she would keep listening. Somewhere in the clamor of opinions and half-remembered sightings, the truth was waiting quietly, patiently, like an old woman with a ball of wool. Chapter 3, Early Investigation. The morning after the fete, St. Mary Me awoke to a gray sky that seemed to mirror the mood of its inhabitants. At Rose Cottage, Inspector Craig stood in the garden, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Ash surveyed the rose arbor. The constable had cordoned off the area with twine thou. A few curious villagers still lingered at the gate, craning their necks for a glimpse of the proceedings. Ellen Ward's body had been removed to the mortuary in much venom, but the crushed hydrosis and stained soil remained a silent testament to the violence that had shattered the fete. Miss Jane Marple watched from a discreet distance, seated on a bench near the churchyard, with her knitting bag at her side. She had no intention of intruding. Inspector Craddock was a capable man after all, but she found it useful to observe how people behaved in the wake of such an event. Her eyes, bright and bird-like beneath the brim of her hat, followed the inspector as he paced the scene, occasionally stooping to examine the ground. Croc was methodical, his notebook already thick with observations. The blow to Elon's head had come from behind head, noted likely with something heavy and blunt. No weapon had been found down The constable was combing the shrubbery, the time of death, according to the hour. Grayson's initial assessment was sometime between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, when the fate was at its peak. Plenty of people had been milling a budget no one claimed to have. Seeing the fatal moment, a clever killer, Craig muttered to himself, or a lucky bum. Key turned his attention to the witness sesimoning them one by one to the drawing room of Rose Cottage, where Mrs. Henchawad reluctantly agreed to let him set up shop. Miss Marple, with her usual knack for being unobtrusive, had been invited in for a cup of tea by Lily, who seemed eager for company amid her mistress's distress from her perch near the window. She could hear snippets of the interviews through the open door, her presence unnoticed. Hosts, preoccupied with their own tales. Dr. Philip Grayson was first, his youthful face. Keechan was near the tea tent most of the afternoon. He stayed his voice steady, but his fingers twisting the cuff of his sleeve. I saw Ellen earlier. She stopped to say hello, but she seemed distracted. I didn't think much of it until until she was found. Katuk pressed him on the Tim and Kond. Grayson hesitated. I suppose I stepped away for a few minutes around 3:30, needed a breath of air. But I didn't go near the arbor. Miss Marple tilted her head, slightly needing the faint flush that crept up his neck. A breath of air, indeed, she thought young men often had reasons for slipping away that they didn't care. Share next came Mr. Leonard Price, who strode in with the air of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. I was by the bandstand, watching those fools make a racket, he said gruffly. Saw Ellen skulking about earlier, kept to herself as usual. Didn't see her go to the arbor, and I didn't see who did her in. If that's what you're after. His tone was sharp, but his eyes darted to the window, as though expecting to see something or someone. Their mercenary followed her hands, trembling as she clutched a handkerchief. I was so busy with the guest, she said, her voice thin and tearful. Ellen came to admire the roses. It told her to take a cutting if she liked, but she just smiled and said she'd think about it. I didn't see her again until, oh, it's too dreadful. She dissolved into quiet sobs and crouched with a silent. Her go. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over what she'd heard. They all had their stories neatly packaged and delivered, perhaps too neatly. She thought of Elon's reticle again, the way it had been clutched so tightly. Lily, she said softly, turning to the maid who was hovering nearby with a tray. Did they find Elon's little bag with her body? Kay seemed to recall she had it with her. Lily frowned, setting the tray down. I don't know, miss. I didn't see it when they took her away, but there was such a fuss, I might have missed it. Why do you ask? Oh, no reason, Miss Marple replied, with a vague smile. It's just that a woman's bag can tell you so much about her. Donnie, think where she's been, what she's been doing. She returned to her knitting, leaving Lily to puzzle over the remark. Outside, Crouch emerged from thicket-age, his expression grim. He spotted Miss Marple on her bench and crossed Ellen to join her. Well, Miss Marple, he said, tipping his hat at. Muddled so far, no one saw anything, or so they say. What's your take on it? She looked up her needles, pausing. It's early days. Expected people are still too shaken to think straight, or too careful to say what they really know. Booty did wonder about Ellen's reticule. She seemed so attached to it, yet I haven't thought it mentioned. Perhaps it's worth a look. Craig raised an eyebrow, then nodded. Good point. I'll have the constable check the arbor again in her cottage. To Yahave, a sharp eye, Miss Marple. He tipped his hat again and strode off, calling to his men. Miss Marple watched him go, her gaze drifting back to the rose arbor. She thought of Ellen's distracted air, the way she'd hovered near the roses. Thetramer in Dr. Grayson's voice when he spoke. Of stepping away patterns, she mused, small human patterns that others overlooked. A reticule missing a petal-stained man, too quick to explain himself. There were only threads now, but threads had a way of weaving into something larger if one knew how. To follow them, she picked up her knitting again, the click of her needles blending with the distant murmur of the village. There was more to hear, more to see, and she intended to be there when it came to light. Chapter 4, First Suspects. By midday, the drizzle had cleared, leaving St. Mary Me damp and glistening under a weak sun. Inspector Krauk had set up a makeshift quartz key in the village hall, where a chalkboard now bore a rough timeline of the fate and the list of names. The investigation was gathering pace, and with it came the inevitable pointing of fingers, the villagers eager for resolution, or perhaps just a scapegoat, had begun to settle on their first suspect, and as Miss Jane Marple well knew, the obvious choice was rarely the right tone. She sat in her usual pew at St. Mary's Church that afternoon, ostensibly to hear the vicar's sermon on charity, but really to listen to the whispers that rustled through the congregation like leaves in a breeze. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was a gentle soul, but even he couldn't resist a passing reference. Tough shadow that has fallen over our little community. The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the murmurs that followed. "It's got to be that Grayson fellow," muttered Mr. Higgs, the butcher from the row behind, her new to Thaffledge, always fidgeting. "Looks guilty as sin to me." His wife hushed him, but her nod suggested agreement. "Nonsense," hissed Mrs. Finch, the postmistress from across aisle. "He's a Dr. White. He risk it. I say, it's Leonard Price. That man's Gautier temper, like a kettle on the boil." And Ellen was always poking into his busness. Her companion, a thin woman in a faded shawl, plucked her tongue in assent. Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly as she adjusted her H-book. The village had its theories, each colored by personal grudges or idle fancy. She glanced toward the front pew where Dr. Philip Grayson sat stiffly, Hitchens clasped too tightly in his lap. Beside him, Mr. Leonard Price glowered his altar, his jaw set as though daring anyone to accuse him outright. Suspicion's thought was a curious thing. It revealed more about the accuser than the cast. After the service, the congregation spilled into the churchyard, clustering in knots to dissect the morning's findings. Inspector Krauk had let slip, perhaps deliberately, that a heavy brass paper weight was missing from Mrs. Henshaw's drawing room, last seen on the mantelpiece during the faint. This was the sort of thing that could crush a skull, it said, and the village had seized on it like hounds on a scent. By tea time, the tide of opinion had turned firmly towards Dr. Grayson. Mrs. Pantry, calling on Miss Marple with a plate of scones, was positively triumphant. "It's as plain as day, Jane," she declared, settling into an armchair. "That paperweight was right there in the cottage, and who would have easier access than the doctor? He was in and out all afternoon, tending to Mrs. Phipps's indigestion and little Tommy's scraped knee, and he's got those strong hands perfect for wielding a weapon." Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate. "Strong hands, yes," she said mildly, but so many people were in the drawing room that day, Mrs. Henshaw's guests, the maids, even Mr. Price, when he came to complain about the band of paperweight. "Is a small thing to slip into a pocket, isn't it? Or a bag?" She offered Dolly a scone, her tone as casual as if they were discussing the weather. Dolly frowned, then brightened. "You mean Sumi and Niels might have taken it, but Grayson's the one who looked shifty. Everyone's saying he went off alone just before Ellen was found, and he's new. No one nearly knows him." "That's true," Miss Marple conceded, sipping her tea. "Newcomers, doe-tracked. Suspicion, it's human nature. I remember poor Mr. Travis, the curate, who came in '38. Everyone thought he'd stolen the church silver because he had a nervous laugh. Turned out it was the sexton boy with a taste for pawn shops." She smiled faintly. "But Dr. Grayson does seem uneasy, doesn't he?" I wonder why her words were gentle, almost absent-minded, but they planted a seed of doubt in Dolly's mind. She munched her scone thoughtfully, then leaned forward. "You don't think it's him, do you, Jane? You've got that look like you're unraveling something. Oh, I'm just an old woman who notices things, Miss Marple said with a chuckle. I wouldn't dream of unraveling anything before Inspector Craddock has his say. Speaking of which, has he found Elon's reticule yet? I do think it's odd Eth isn't turned up. Dolly shook her head. Not that I've heard. Crack's men searched her cottage this morning. Nothing but needles and thread and a few shillings in a tin. No bag, no letters, nothing to say. Why she'd end up dead in the roses. She paused, then added, though, Lily's still on about that ghost. Says it's a sign Ellen was cursed. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Curse is a convenient explanation, she murmured, but I suspect Ellen's troubles were rather more earthly. She wasn't one for grand gestures. Coming to the fate was out of character. I wonder what drew her. There Dolly left soon after promising Torley any fresh gossip, and Miss Marple sat alone, gazing out at their garden. The village had latched on to Dr. Grayson with the zeal of a pack. Kasinga Fox and Crocs seemed inclined to follow their lead. He'd called Grayson in for a second interview that afternoon, pressing him on his breath of air and his whereabouts when the paperweight Vanish, the doctor's stammered replies. Something about needing to clear his shed after a busy day only fueled the inspector's suspicions, but Miss Marple remained unconvinced. She thought of Grayson's flushed cheeks, Price's restless hands, Mrs. Henshaw's trembling voice. The paperweight was a bold clue, almost too bold, like a signpost pointing the wrong way, and then there was the reticule still, missing a quiet absence that nagged at Hershey. Pictured Ellen clutching at her fingers, white with tension. What had she carried that day? What had she feared losing? Rising from her chair, she crocheted to the window, her gaze settling on the distant silhouette of Rose Cottage. The obvious suspect was a distraction. She felt sure villagers loved a villain they could name, but murder, she knew, was rarely so obliging. It hid in the shadows of ordinary lives, waiting for someone like her to notice the smallest snag in the fabric. Chapter 5, a hidden clue. The afternoon sun slanted through windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting long shadows across theplished floorboards. She sat by the hearth, her knitting eyeline, her lap for once as she turned over the events of the past few days. St. Marine buzzed with the certainty that Dr. Grayson was their man inspector. Cotticoot even taken him to the station for further questioning, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on quieter details, the sort that slipped past louder voices. She rose and crossed to the window, peering out at the lane where children played and villagers heard about their rants. Her thoughts drifted back to the fate Ellen Ward's nervous gait. The ways lingered near the rose arbor, the reticule that had vanished like a wisp of smoke, and then there was the fatality, single rose petal she'd seen beside Ellen's body, torn and smeared with that faint reddish-brown mark it had struck her. As odd at the time, a smelling perfection in the otherwise pristine garden. It's blood perhaps, or something else. She hadn't mentioned it to Craddock. Not yet. It was too slight a thing to call a clue without more to tether it to a knock at the door. Startled her from her reverie. It was Lily. Mrs. Henhouse made her thin face flushed from the walk. Beg pardon, Miss Marple, she said, twisting her apron in her hands. I didn't know wholes to tell, and you have a way of listening, haven't you? It's about the roses. Something queer I noticed this morning. Miss Marple ushered her inside with a warm smile. Come in, dear, and have you a cup of tea. What's this about the roses? Lee perched on the edge of a chair, her eyes darting nervously. Well, Mom's still abed. Fatingover, the fet, and I was tidying the garden, trying to put things right. Yaukno, I went to sweep up near the arbor where poor Miss Ward was found, and I saw some mething stuck in the dirt. It was a bit of thread, bright green, like the kind she used for her sewing. I wouldn't have thought much of it, but it was caught under a stone, like someone tried to hide it. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained mild. Green thread. You say, how interesting, and you found it near Theobald. Yes, Miss Lily nodded eagerly, right where the roses got trampled. I left it there, didn't want to meddle, but it got me thinking. Miss Ward was always sewing wasin. She made beads from that bag of hers. The one you asked about, perhaps, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, pouring tea from the pot. It's a small thing, Vincent, but small things can matter terribly. Did you tell? Inspector Katakali shook her head. No, miss. He's so busy with Dr. Grayson, and I didn't think he'd care for a bit of thread, but it felt wrong, too. Keep quiet, so I came to you. You did quite right, Lily, Miss Marple said, handing her the cup. I'll mention it to the inspector when I see him. It's good to notice what others miss. She paused, then added casually, Tell me, did Ellen ever sew anything for Mrs. Henshaw? A dress, perhaps, or a cushion cover? Lily frowned, sipping her tea. Not that I recall, miss. Moms particularly get your things from much venom, mostly, but Miss Ward did mend a tablecloth for Herons a few weeks back. Spilled wine on it, Mom did, and made a right fuss. Miss Ward fixed it up, quiet like, didn't charge much. Neither. Miss Marple nodded, filing tea to tell away. How kind of her. She was a helpful soul. Wasn't she always ready with her needle? Lily lingered a little longer, chattering about Mrs. Henschel's nerves and the ghostly figure she still swore she'd seen. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere after the girl left. She sat again, her gaze fixed on the fire-green thread under a stone, a deliberate act, perhaps, to conceal it. And yet, it had been overlooked, just like the petal, just like the reticule she pictured. Ellen had fed her hands, clutching that bag, her eyes darting as though expecting trouble. What did she carry that day? Something worth hiding, or something worth killing. Fourth, next morning, she took her usual walk past Rose Cottage, her pace slow and deliberate. The garden was quiet now. The fate's wreckage cleared away, but the arbor bore the faint scars of that afternoon trampled earth-broken stems. She paused, near the spot where Ellen had fallen, her eyes scanning the ground. The constable had searched it thoroughly, or so claimed, but Miss Marple knew how easily a busy man could miss what didn't shout for attention there, half buried in the soil, near a rose bush. She saw it, a glint of metal naviger, then a shilling. She bent, stiffly careful, not to disturb the scene, and peered closer. It was a small clasp, the kind that might fasten a reticule, its surface scratched, but intact. She straightened with a soft hum, leaving it where it lay, a clasp without a bag. Curiouser and curiouser, she made her way to the village hall, where Crack was poring over his notes. He looked up as she entered, his mustache twitching with faint amusement. Miss Marple, he said, might have known you'd turn up. What's on your mind, Kay? Oh, nothing much, she replied, settling gonto. A chair. I just thought you might like to know. What, Kay? Lily found near Thurber a bit of green thread, caught under a stone, and while I was out this morning, noticed a little clasp in the soil, not far from where Ellen was found. It's probably nothing, of course, but I do wonder if it might belong to her. Tika Lukatak's eyes narrowed, and he scribbled a note thread in a clasp. We'll have a look at bags. Been a ghost itself. Can't find it anywhere. Grayson swears hadn't see it, and her cottage was clean as a whistle. He paused, then added, You think it's important, don't you? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think it's missing, Inspector, and things that go missing often have a story to tell, but you're an expert. I'm sure you'll sort it out. She rose, smoothing her skirt to leave you to it. As she walked home, the clasp and death thread danced in her thoughts. They were small, yes, but they whispered of Ellen's last moments, of a struggle, perhaps, or a secret. She'd tried to keep the village, might be content with Dr. Grayson, but Miss Marple felt that pattern shifting the threads, pulling towards something or someone else entirely. Chapter 6, Confrontations and Secrets. Discovery of the green thread and the clasp sent a ripple through Inspector Craddock's devastation, though the village remained fixated on Dr. Grayson. by the afternoon, the air in St. Mary Mead was thick with speculation, and the quiet lanes buzzed with whispered theories. Miss Jane Marple, however, sensed the tide turning not toward resolution, but into deeper waters, where the past churned up its hidden currents. She sat in her garden, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting a pretext as she watched the comings and goings of Herney birds. At Rose Cottage, Mrs. Clara Henshaw had emerged from her self-imposed seclusion, though her pale face and trembling hands betrayed her runes. She stood in the doorway, wringing a handkerchief as Cadix Constables guard the arbor. Once more, the clasp had been retrieved, a small tarnished stank in the thread, carefully bagged, though its significance remained elusive. "I don't know what it means," Mrs. Henshaw said to Mrs. Clement, who'd come to offer tea and sympathy. "Ellen was just a seamstress. Why would anyone take her bag?" Mrs. Clement patted her arm. There, Clara. It's all a muddle now, but the inspector will sort it. Perhaps she'd gotten mixed up with someone." Unsavory tone was kind, but her eyes flicked toward the lane, where Dr. Grayson's bishop leaned against the wall, a silent accusation. Miss Marple, overhearing this from her garden gate, noted the exchange with interest. To Mrs. Henshaw's distress seemed genuine, but there was a brittleness to it, a note of strain that lingered beneath her tears. She thought of the oblique-cloth Ellen had mended. Such a small act, yet it tied the two women together in a way no one else had mentioned. That evening, the Blue Brine became a crucible for the village's simmering tensions. Mr. Leonard Price sat in a usual corner, his thin frame hunched over a pint, when Tar Grayson entered his coat damp from a sudden shower. The room fell quiet, the clink of glasses pausing as eyes turned toward the doctor. Price straightened his lips, curling into a sneer. "Well, if it isn't our resident murderer," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the hush. "Come to drown your guilt in ale, have you?" Grayson froze, his face flushing crimson. "That's a vile thing to say." Price hair-plied, his voice tight. "I've done nothing wrong. You've no right to accuse him, no right." Price shot back, slamming his glass on the table. "You were skulking about that fate, disappearing when no one was looking. And no, they found bits of Ellen's bag. Convenient, isn't it, that you were so close by?" The doctor took a step forward, fists clenched, but the barman intervened, a burly hand on Grayson's shoulder. "Easy now, lads," he said gruffly. "No brawling in my pub. Take it outside, if you must." Grayson shook off the grip, his jaw working. "I don't need to justify myself to you, Price, or anyone. Elsif told Craddock where it was, and that's enough." He turned on his heel and stormed out, leaving a murmur of voices in his wake. Miss Marple learned of the confrontation from Dolly Bantry, who arrived at her cottage the next morning with a gleam in her eye. "It's all any owner can talk about Jane," she exclaimed, settling into her usual chair. Price practically called Grayson a killer to his face. "Everyone's saying there's bad blood between them, and now this thread business. Do you think it's from Ellen's bag?" "It might be," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with her usual calm, "though I wonder it was hidden so carefully and under a stone, too. It's not where it usually ends up, is it?" She handed Dolly a cup, her tone light but probing. Dolly frowned. "You mean someone put it there, but why? Unless," she gasped, leaning forward, "unless it's a plan to make Grayson look guilty or to make someone else look innocent." Smart murmured, her eyes crinkling faintly. "But we mustn't jump ahead. Tell me, Dolly, did Ellen ever have dealings with Mr. Price? He seems awfully keen to point fingers down." They tapped her chin. "Not that I know of, though she did mend a jacket for Hyman's years ago, mind you." He grumbled about the cost, as he does of boot everything. "But bad blood, I'd say Price has that with half the village. He's ass or old stick." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the threads of connection. Ellen's needle had stitched her into many lives, Mrs. Hinch Stableth Price's jacket, countless small repairs. Seamstress saw hard things in the quiet of her work. Had she seen too much later that day, Crack paid her a visit, his expression weary. "You've got a knack for stirring the pot, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair that clasped the thread. Turns out the clasp matches one from a reticle, Ellen's. Neighbors saw her with a week ago green thread too. She used it for a dress she was making, but why? It's in the garden, and where the bag's gone. "I can't fathom. Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple replied, offering him a biscuit. "A bag doesn't just vanish unless someone wants it too, and that thread under the stone, almost as if it were left to be found. Don't you think?" Crack's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting a set of raisins. The obvious one to pin it on, but he's sticking to his story. Says he was near the hedge. Nowhere near the arbor. Price swears he saw him lurking down." "Mr. Price does like to swear two things," Miss Marple said mildly. "People see what they expect to see, especially when they're cross. I wonder what Ellen saw, though, before she fell kraut." Rubbed his chin. "Her cottage gave us nothing, no letters, no diary, just sewing and a few keepsakes. Whatever sheckman, she kept it close." "Or in her reticule," Miss Marple added softly, her needles resuming their rhythm. "A woman's bag is her castle inspector. I'd keep looking for it." He left with a nod, promising to widen the search, and Miss Marple sat back, her thoughts weaving a tapestry of secret graces. Temper Price's venom, Mrs. Henshaw's nerves, each revealed a crack in the village's facade, and Ellen, quiet Ellen, had slipped through those cracks, her needle threading lives together until one snapped. The reticule held the key, she felt sure. But who had taken it, and why? Chapter 7. Another twist. The days following the confrontation at the Blue Oar and Sea brought a restless energy to St. Mary Meath Village, so quick to pin Ellen Ward's murder on Dr. Grayson found its certainty shaken by a new and startling development. Miss Jane Marple, sipping Tyene, her parlor, sensed the shift before the news reached. Her years of watching human nature had honed her instincts for the unexpected. When Dolly Bantry burst through the door that morning, her hat askew and her eyes wide, Miss Marple set her cup down with a knowing hum. "Jane, you'll never believe it, Dolly," exclaimed, flopping into a chair. They'd found something dreadful at Ellen's cottagey crowds. Men went back for another look, and there it was, hidden under the floorboards. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene. "Do go on, Dolly. What did they find?" "A letter," Dolly said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Torn to bits, mind you, but they pieced it together. It was from Ellen to someone she didn't name, and it said she knew something terrible. Something she couldn't keep quiet about any longer. She wrote she'd meet them at the fete to settle it once seemed for all. Jane, she was blackmailing someone." Miss Marple's needles paused at mid-stitch, though her face betrayed no surprise. "Blackmail," she murmured. "How very dramatic. Did the letters say what she knew?" Dolly shook her head. "Not a word, just that it was a sin too dark to bear. And she'd proof in her keeping caddick things. It's why her reticule's gone. Whatever she had, the killer took it. Oh, Jane, it's positively thrilling." "Who do you suppose she was writing? To someone you didn't want their secret aired, I imagine," Miss Marple replied, pouring Dolly a cup of tea. "Though it's curious she tore it up. Perhaps she thought bitter of sending it. Or someone else did it for her." Dolly took the home cup, Herman racing. "You mean the killer got to it first? But why hide it under their floorboards? Why not burn it?" "People do odd things when they're frightened," Miss Marple said mildly. "Or when they're in a hurry. I dare say Ellen's cottage was in the safest place to linger. After what happened," she sipped her tear eyes, crinkling faintly. "What does Inspector Craddock McCuff it? He's in a tizzy." Dolly said, grinning. "Let Grayson go this morning. Says the letter changes everything now. He's got half the village under suspicion again. Price is crowing about being right, of course. And Mrs. Henshaw's taken to Erbed again, claiming it's all too much. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to the rose arbor, the green thread, the missing greticle. A letter under the floorboards was a twist indeed, proof that Ellen had been more than a quiet seamstress. She'd held a secret one, worth killing for Andy. Fate had been her stage, but who had she meant to meet? And we hide the letter, rather than destroy it that afternoon. Crowd called at her cottage, his notebook bulging with fresh scribbles. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat as he stepped inside. "You've a way of being ahead of me. That treaty killed business. Seems you were right. This letter's got me thinking." Ellen had something in it, something the killer couldn't risk leaving behind. "It does seem likely," Miss Marple agreed, offering him a chair. A woman like Ellen, quiet, watchful, she'd keep her proof close, wouldn't she? What did the letter say exactly? Croc flipped open his notebook and read aloud. "Can't bear it any longer. The sin I've seen weighs on me night and day. I have proof and I'll bring it to the fate. Meet me there, or I'll tell all." He closed the book with a snap tornado, a dozen pieces stuffed under a loose board in her parlor. No name, no date, just that Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "No name," she echoed. "How inconvenient, but it's a bold move, isn't it, writing it down, even if she didn't send it? I wonder what made her so certain and so afraid." Prout rubbed his chin. "Blackmails, my guess. She saw something, or heard it, maybe in her sewing room stitching away while folks talked. But who? Grayson's alibi is shaky. But this letter doesn't point straight at him. Price has a temper, and Mrs. Henchy is jumpy as a cat. But there's no thread to tie them yet. Pardon the pun." Miss Marple smiled at that. "Threads do have a way of tangling, don't they, like that green '09, the garden, I suppose." "You've searched the arbor again, top to bottom," Croc said. "Nothing new, just a clasp and that bit of thread. But this letter, it's got the killer's deception written all over it. Okay, they thought they'd covered their tracks, taking the bag, but they misaid it, or left it." Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. A torn letter is a curious thing to hide, almost as if they wanted it found. But not too soon. She looked up, her tone brightening. "But you'll work it out, Inspector, you will ways." "Do." Croc left with a grunt of determination, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind weaving through the new twist. Ellen had known a sin too dark to bear something personal, something close. The fate hadn't been a random choice, it was a reckoning. She thought of Mrs. Henshaw's Rose's price bitterness, Grayson's unease. The letter shifted the focus, yes, but it also deepened the deception, cloaking the killer in fresh shadows. As dusk fell, she took her revening stroll past Ellen's cottage, a squat little place with darkened windows. The constable on guard tipped his hat, and she paused, gazing at the rose bushes lining the path, smaller, humbler than those at Rose Cottage, but well-tended. A memory flickered Ellen at the fate, admiring Mrs. Hennaw's blooms, her voice soft with nostalgia. "They remind me of my mother's garden," she'd said. Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. Gardens and secrets both grew, quietly unseen, until they broke the surface back home. She sat by the fire, the letter's words echoing in her mind, a sin, a meeting, a proof taken. The killer had struck to silence Ellen, but the letter's survival was a crack in their plan. Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening the threads. Drawing closer, she'd wait, and she'd watch for the next slip. The next snag would surely come. Chapter 8, Miss Marple's Final Test. The discovery of Ellen Ward's letter hung over St. Mary Mead like a storm cloud, its shadow deepening the village's zoomies. Inspector Craddock's investigation turned on his men, scouring every hedgerow and paddock for the missing reticule, while the villagers traded theories with renewed fervor. Miss Jane Marple, however, felt the time had come to nudge the threads off this mystery a little closer to the light. She sat in her parlor, her Nitinga, soft counterpoint to the ticking clock, her mind tracing the pattern. She'd begun to see it was a pattern of human frailty offscripts, buried in plain sight of glances that lingered too long or darted away too quickly. The letter had confirmed Ellen's intent. She'd gone to the fate to confront someone armed with proof of a sin too dark to bear. The ridicule's absence pointed to the killer's desperation, but the torn letter under the floorboards suggested haste or miscalculation. Miss Marple suspected the truth lay not in grand gestures, but in the quiet corners of ordinary lives, and so she decided to set a gentle trap. That afternoon, she invited Mrs. Clara Henshaw for tea, sending Lily with a note that read, "Simply do, dear, I have some rose cutings I thought you might like." Mrs. Henshaw arrived promptly at 3, her face pale, but composed, her hand smoothing her skirt as she settled into Miss Marple's best armchair. The room smelled faintly of lavender and baking, a cozy contrast to the tension that simmered beneath there. "Politiques change. How kind of you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Henshaw said, accepting a cup with a faint smile. "I've hardly known what to do with myself since the fate. Those roses, I can't bear to look at them." "Kay, I quite understand," Miss Marple replied, her tone soothing its dreadfulest. How a single moment can spoil such beauty. Poor Ellen, she was so fond of your garden. I remember her saying how the roses reminded her of her mother's." She paused, watching Mrs. Henshaw's fingers tighten on the cup. "Yes, she did say that," Mrs. Heno murmured, her eyes dropping to her lap. "She was a quiet thing. Never thought she'd come to such an end." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "Quiet, yes, but watchful. Suppose that's why she noticed things others didn't, like that tablecloth she minted for usage. A small task, but she took it to heart, didn't she? I wonder if she ever mentioned anything odd while she was at Rose Cottage." Mrs. Tino's head jerked up, her smile faltering. "Odd? No, nothing I recall. She just sewed and left, barely spoke a word." Her voice was too quick to brittle, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hand as she set the cup down. "Of course," Miss Marple said mildly, "though it's funny how much a seamstress hears, isn't it? People talk around them as if they're part of the furniture." I was thinking of her ridicule. Such a pity its loss. She clung to it so tightly, at the fat almost, as if she were guarding something precious. A letter perhaps, or something smaller, like a key. Mrs. Henshaw's face drained of color, her lips parting, so to speak, then closing again. "A key," she echoed faintly. I wouldn't know why. Would she have a key?" "Oh, I'm just musing," Miss Marple said, with a vague way. "Old women do that, don't they?" But it's curious, that letter they found, torn and hidden, yet not destroyed, almost as if someone wanted it kept, but out of sight. I suppose we'll never know what she carried in that bag. Mitro Miseshna stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt with unsteady hands. "I really must go," she said, her voice high. "Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple. Take those cutings another day." She hurried out, leaving her cup half full on the table. Miss Marple watched her go, her eyes narrowing slightly. Mrs. Henshaw's reaction had been telling a sure crack in her fragile shell. A flicker of fear at the mention of a key. She thought of Rose Cottage, its locked drawers and quiet rooms, and of Ellen's visits. There a seamstress saw more than seams. She saw lives unstitched by careless words or guilty glances. The next day, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village hall, where Croc was sifting through witness statements. She found him hunched over a desk, his mustache drooping with fatigue. "Miss Marple," he greeted, straightening, "come to unravel me again." "Hardly, Inspector," she said with a smile, settling onto a chair. "I just had a little chat with Mrs. Henshaw yesterday. Nothing important, of course, but just seemed awfully rattled when and mentioned Elon's ridicule. I wonder if she knows more than she's let on. Craddock's brow furrowed. Henshaw. She's been a wreck since the fete. Keep saying it's her fault for hosting it. You think she's shouting something? I think she's afraid, Miss Marple replied softly. And fear makes people do strange things, like tearing a letter or taking a bag, and mentioned a key just in passing, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. Perhaps Selin had something from Rose Cottage, something Mrs. Henshaw didn't want. Found Crouch scribbled a note. His interest piqued. A key. A wee searched her place. Nothing locked. That shouldn't be, but I'll have another look. She was near Thurber that day, fussing with her guests. Could have slipped away, could she? Miss Marple mused. She's not a strong woman, but desperation lends strength, doesn't it? And Ellen was so small, hardly a match for any editor mind. She rose, smoothing her shawl. I'll leave it to you, Inspector. You've acted for finding what's hidden back home. Miss Marple sat by her window, her trap set, and its echoes still ringing. Mrs. Henshaw's panic had confirmed a suspicion. Elon's secret touched Rose Cottage, and the reticule held its proof. A key, perhaps, to a drawer, a box, a past locked away. She thought, off the green thread, the torn letter, the blood-smeared petal. The killer had acted swiftly, but not flawlessly, and now rattled by a fugitive words. They might act again, revealing more than they meant. To Chapter 9. Revealed the evening after Miss Marple's steer with Mrs. Henshaw settled over St. Mary Mead with a quiet that felt almost expect. The village had buzzed all day with whispers of the letter that threatened Dr. Grayson's release, but as dusk, a paint of the sky, and shades of violet astleness took hold, Jane Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm, her hands, her mind, piecing together the final threads of Ellen Ward's murder. She knew the truth. Now, not from grand evidence, but from the small human tales that had whispered it to her all along. Inspector Crouch arrived just as Locke struck 7. His face a mix of triumph and exhaustion. With him came Ursula Henshaw, her eyes red, rimmed, and her hands clasped tightly in her lapels. She was ushered into the parlor. Behind them stood Lily, the maid, her thin frame trembling, but her chin lifted with a defiance Miss Marple hadn't seen before. The room felt charged, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. As Miss Marple Craddock began tipping his hat. You've done it again. I follow we did nudge about Mrs. Henshaw searched Rose Cottage top to bottom this afternoon. Found Ellen's reticule stuffed in a hollowed-out book on the shelf, and inside it, a key to a locked box under Heno's bed. Mrs. Henshaw let out a soft, choked sound, her hands rising to her face. Miss Marple looked at her with gentle pity, her needles pausing. I thought it might be something like that, she said quietly. A key to a secret. Wasn't it something Ellen stumbled upon while she was mending your tablecloth? Crouch nodded, pulling a small brass key from his pocket. This opened a box full of letters, sold ones from years back, love letters, mostly between Mrs. Henshaw and a man named Robert Dane. Turns out he was married, died in a boating accident 10 years ago, but not before leaving her with a tidy sum checked. A quiet, lived modestly, but Ellen must have found out. Mrs. Henshaw's voice broke through, thin and desperate. I didn't mean to hurt her, I swear it. She came to the fate clutching that bag, saying she'd tell everyone unless I paid her. She'd seen the letters when she fixed my tablecloth, slipped one out from under cloth where I'd hidden it. She kept it, said it was proof of my sin. I panicked. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her gaze remained steady. And so you followed her to the arbor, she said, her tone as gentle as if she were discussing a spilled cup of tea. You took the paperweight from your drawing room, didn't you? It was there on the mantelpiece, heavy and close to hand. Mrs. Henshaw nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She wouldn't listen, checked, saying I'd ruined her life. that I owed her. I begged her to stop, but shuddered away. And I just swung. I didn't mean to kill her, only to stop her then. I took the bag, tore up her letter when I found it at her cottage hid. I tender the floorboards. I thought it would be over. Krauk crossed his arms, his voice firm, but not unkind. But it wasn't you. Missed the key in her reticule must have been sewn into the lining. In that thread, you dropped a clasp that fell sloppy. Work, Mrs. Tenure. You hid the badge in your own house, thinking no one had looked there. Miss Marple picked up the tale, her voice threading the clues together. The green thread was from her swing caught. When you struggled, the clasp broke off in the scuffle. And Thepto, smeared with blood, fell when you struck her. You didn't notice, did you? You were too frightened. And when I mentioned the key yesterday, you knew the net was closing. Mrs. Henshaw sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I couldn't bear it, everyone. Knowing I'd loved a married man, that I'd lived off his money. Helene wouldn't let it go. She said, I had no right to my peace when she'd none of her own. Lily stepped forward, then her voice shaking, but clear. She was jealous. Mamas, Miss Ward told me once, said Mrs. Henshaw had everything, she'd never have your home or life. I didn't know she'd turn so bitter. Miss Marple nodded, hair expression thoughtful. Jealousy is a quiet poison, isn't it? Ellen saw your secret as her chance. Perhaps she thought it had righted some wrong she felt, but accidentally unraveled her instead. Krauk cleared his throat, signaling to the constable at the door. Clara Henshaw, I'm arresting you for the murder of Ellen. Ward will sort the rest at the station. He turned to Miss Marple, her eyes, smile tugging at his lips. You've a way with these things, Miss Marple. I'd have been chasing Grayson for weeks, if not for you. Oh, I just noticed what's there, Inspector, she replied, her eyes twinkling faintly. People are so much like knitting, aren't they? A drop stitch here, a tangle there. It all comes clear if you follow the pattern. Mrs. Henshaw was led away. Hers holder slumped, and Lily followed, casting a grateful glance at Miss Marple. The parlor fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft click off needles resuming their work. Krauk lingered a moment, tipping his hat once Simmer. That key, he said. How do you know it was a key? I didn't, Miss Marple admitted, smiling, but a reticule's a small thing, and Ellen clung to it so fiercely. It had to hold something worth her life, and yours too, in the end. A key seemed likely did mean something. To unlock a past she couldn't let. Krauk shook his head, half in awe, and took his leave. Miss Marple sat alone, the firelight dancing across her face. The mystery was solved to threads. Tied off, but not without a pang of sadness for Ellen, for Mrs. Henshaw, for the secrets that had bound him. It's human nature, she thought, was a curious stitchery indeed. Chapter 10, Aftermath. The arrest of Mrs. Clary Henshaw settled over St. Mary Mead like a fog that refused to lift. By morning, thin news had spread from doorstep. The doorstep carried on the wings of hush-eyed voices and sidelong glances. The village, so eager for a culprit, now grappled with the weight of its own judgment. Mrs. Henshaw, the Kinley widow of Rose Cottage. A murderer, driven by fear and shame. The fate, once a cherished memory, had become a tale to be whispered over Teats roses, forever tainted. Miss Jane Marple sat in Herget, a shawl draped over her shoulders against the early chill. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a tentative light on her roses, smaller and less grand than those at Rose Cottage, but dear to her all the same. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, a rare pause as she watched the village stir back to life. Children played in the lane, their laughter a faint echo of normally, while women gathered at the post office, their chatter subdued. But persistent Dally Bantry arrived shortly after breakfast, her usual exuberance tempered by the gravity of the moment. Jane, she said, settling onto the garden bench with a sigh, I still can't believe it. Clara Henshaw, of all people, I thought, faint at the sight of a spider. let alone kill someone. And over those letters, Miss Marple offered a small, wistful smile. Fear does strange things. Dolly Mrs. Henshaw lived with her secret so long, it became a part of her, like a shadow shackled and shake. Ellen's threat pulled it into the light, and she couldn't bear that. Siggled her head, accepting a cup of tea from the tray Miss Marple had set out, but to hit her with that paper weight right there in the arbor, and then tow-hide the bag in her own house. It's Mad Jane. How do you know it, Washa? Oh, I didn't know. Not at first, Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but she was so nervous. Wasn't she more than the fate warranted? And when I mentioned the quiche, unraveled, just a little, but enough, it's always the small things, Dolly. The way people look away or don't. Ellen's ridicule was the key in more ways than only. Dolly sipped her tea, her brow furrowing. Poor Ellen, though blackmail's a nasty business. I suppose she felt cheated, seeing Clarada with her cottage and her roses, while she stitched away in that little H veil. But to die for it, yes, Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting to the roses' jealousies. A quiet thief, it steals reason before you know it's gone. Ellen wanted to right a wrong, or so she had thought, but she only tangled herself deeper, and Mrs. Henshaw, well, she paid a price for her past, long before. She swung that paperweight. The village hall buzzed with activity that day, as Inspector Crouch wrapped up his case. The reticule, the Keith letters, all were catalogued and filed. The story of Ellen's death, pieced together in official ink. Mrs. Henshaw had been taken to much Benoon, her fate now in the hands of a judge, though whispers of leniency floated through the village. Her tears, her broken confession, had softened some hearts. Dr. Grayson cleared off suspicion, resumed his rounds, his head held a little higher, while Mr. Leonard Price retreated to his sour solitude, his accusations silenced, but his scowl intact. Lily, too, found her place in the aftermath. She stayed on at Rose Cottage, the garden, with a quiet resolve, though she avoided the arbor. Miss Marple had seen her that morning, clipping dead blooms with a steady hand, and had given her a nod of approval. The girl would manage, she thought. Life had a way of stitching itself back together, even after such a tear as Dolly chattered, on speculating out the trial, the letters, the ghost that never was. Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. She saw the pattern clearly. Now, Elon's envy. Mrs. Hench's panic. The fate, as their fatal crossing the green thread, the clasp their blood smeared. Petal each a stitch in a tapestry of human frailty. She'd unraveled it, as she always did, not with fanfare, but with the patience of an old woman who knew where to look. The sun climbed higher, warming the garden, and Miss Marple picked up her knitting. At last, it's a sad business, Dolly, she said softly, her needles clicking once more. But people are so very muck themselves, aren't they? They can't help it, even when they try. That's what makes them so interesting and so predictable in the end. Dolly laughed a little rovely. You're a marvel, Jane. I'd never have seen it. Clara Henshaw, a killer. What will happen to Rose Cottage now? Do you think, oh, it'll stand? Miss Marple replied, her eyes crinkling. Houses, do you know, they weather worse than this, and the rose will bloom again. Come spring, they always do. Dolly left soon after, promising torn with any news from much. Benham and Miss Marple sat alone, the garden quit around her. The unease lingered, a faint thread woven into the village's fabric, but life would go on. Teas would be poured, subtraded children sent to play. She thought of Ellen, of Mrs. Potential, of the secrets that had bound them. Human nature, she mused, was a curious thing, forever blooming, forever pruning itself back, with a final glance at her roses. She pinned to her knitting, the rhythm steady, the pattern sure. Another mystery solved, another stitch tied off in saint. Marry me for all its shadows, remained her home chapter. 11. The unseen thread. A week had passed since Mrs. Clara Henshaw's arrest in Sta Mary Me seemed to exhale its rhythms, settling into the familiar hum of lake summer. The roses at Rose Cottage stood tall, tended now by Lily's careful, hands-down view. Villagers lingered to admire them. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, a letter from Inspector Craddock open on the table beside her. It detailed Mrs. Henshaw's confession in full, her quiet life undone by a moment of terror, and confirmed the trial date. In much Benham yet, as Miss Marple gazed at the neat handwriting, her thoughts drifted beyond the ink to a thread she hadn't fully pulled. She rose and crossed to the window, her eyes tracing the lane where Ryland Ward's cottage stood, its shutters closed. Like a mourner-sized letter, Craddock found a torn plea hidden under the floorboards. Had been the key to Mrs. Henshaw's undoing, but something about it nagged at Miss Marple. Ellen had written of a sin too dark to bear, a secret she'd planned to confront it. The fit, but why tear it up? Why hide it on Lido carry-proof in her reticule instead? It was a loose stitch, a quiet inconsistency in an otherwise tidy pattern. That afternoon, she decided to visit Ellen's cottage, her steps slow but purposeful. The constable had long since left, and the place stood empty, its silence broken only by the rustle of leaves against the stone walls. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her sharp eye scanning the rose bushes Ellen had loved. They were wilting now, neglected in the wake of her death, and she felt a pang of regret for the woman who tended them. The door creaked as she pushed it open, unlocked as village doors often were, and she stepped inside. The air was stale thick with the descent of dust and old fabric Ellen's sewing. Table sat in the corner, a pincushion and a skit of green thread still atop it, as though she might return at any moment. Miss Marple moved to the parlor, where the floorboard had concealed the letter, and knelt stiffly peering at the spot crocks. Men had pried loose there in the dim light. She saw it, a faint scratch in the wood, no other than a needle's point, half hidden by the board's edge. She traced it with her finger, her brow furrowing. It formed a tiny, irregular shape, a circle with a line through it like a crude symbol. She sat back on her heels, hermit turning, and Ellen scratched it there herself. It's a mark of her secret perhaps, or a sign left in haste. Rising, she wandered to the sewing table, her fingers brushing the green thread. She thought of the arbor, that blood-smeared petal, the clasp of the struggle, and then Mrs. Henshaw's tearful confession. Ellen had been jealous, yes, driven by a bitterness that twisted into blackmail. But this mark felt personal, a whisper from beyond the grave. Miss Marple pictured Ellen at her table stitching, late into the night, her quiet life unraveling as she uncovered Marciana's past. Had she meant to leave a clue, a final thread for someone to find back? At her cottage, she wrote a brief note to Croc, mentioning the scratch without pressing its meaning. It's probably nothing, she concluded, but it thought you might like to know. She sealed it and set it aside, her gaze drifting to her own roses beyond the window. The mystery was solved. Mrs. Henshaw's guilt laid bare, yet this small discovery lingered, a reminder that even the simplest lives held depths no one could fully plumb. That evening, Dolly Bantry called, her curiosity undimmed by the case's close. "Jane, you're not still poking about, are you?" she teased, settling into a chair. "Crowd says it's done and dusted. Clara's trial set, and the village is practically planning a fake toss braid." Miss Marple smiled faintly, pouring tea. "I'm sure they'll find Arison to gather Dolly, but I did take a little walk to Ellen's cottage. Today's such a sad, empty place now. I found a mark under the floorboard where Thelitor was hidden. A tiny thing scratched into the wood." Dolly's eyes widened. "A mark? What sort? Some secret code?" "Oh, nothing so grand," Miss Marple chuckled. "Just a circle with a line could be anything really, a slip of her needle, perhaps, or a moment's frustration, but it made me think of Ellen, how much she kept inside, even from herself. Leaned forward, intrigued. You think there's more to IT, another secret? No, Miss Marple said, shaking her head. The story's told. You think Mrs. Henshaw killed her, and that's that. But people leave traces, don't they? Little marks of who they were. Ellen's was a quiet life, and yet it stirred up a storm. Dolly sat back, sipping her tea, thoughtfully. You're right, Jane. It's eerie, though. Those traces makes you wonder what else is hiding in this village. Plenty, I expect, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. But most of it stays hidden, and that's just as well. We've had enough excitement for one summer. They chatted a while longer. Fire crackling as night fell, and Miss Marple felt the loose thread settle. Not explained. Perhaps Butte accepted Ellen's mark was her own, a final stitch in a life cut short. That village would move on, as it always did, its secrets tucked away like letters in a box, waiting for the next keen eye to find them. Chapter 12. The rose bloom again. The first hint of autumn crept into St. Mary Me as August gave way to September, the air turning crisp, and the leaves edging toward gold. Rose Cottage stood quieter. Now, its windows dim, without Mrs. Henner's bustling presence, though. Lily's steady care kept the garden alive. The village had begun to heal Equator, shifting from murder to harvest plans, and the vicar's upcoming sermon. Yet beneath the surface, a thread of caution lingered, a reminder that even the coziest corners could harbor shadows. Miss Jane Marple stood at her garden gate, a basket of late roses in her arm, their petals a soft pink against the gray shawl. She'd spent the morning pruning her hands, deft despite their years, and now she watched the lane with her usual quiet attention. Children darted past, their shouts brightening the stillness, while Mr. Higgs, the butcher, trundled by with a nod. Life, she thought, had a way of stitching itself back together, even after the sharpest cut. Her reverie was broken by the clatter of a bicycle. Dr. Philip Grayson, his coat flapping as he pedaled toward her. He slowed, tipping his cap with a sheepish smile. Miss Marple, he said, dismounting, I've been meaning to thank you. If you hadn't pointed guitar elsewhere, I'd still be under lock and key. Miss Marple's eyes crinkled warmly. Oh, nonsense, Doctor. The truth has a way of coming out, doesn't it? You were just a convenient shadow for the village to chase. I'm glad it's behind you. Grayson rubbed the back of his neck, his flush returning. Still I way. I was a fool at the fate slipping off like that. Truth is, I'd hit a row with my sister over the telephone that morning. Needed to clear my head. Beauty looked awful suspicious. A row. Miss Marple tilted her head. Her tone, gentle. Families can be trying, can't they? But it's no crime to Nate. A moment alone, he nodded, relieved. She's in London, always nagging me, toned back. I didn't want it spread about small villages talk, you know. But it's water under the bridge now. I'm settling in. Thanks to you, you'll do well here, Miss Marple said, handing him a rose from her basket. People forget quickly when there's work to be done. Take this for your surgery. It'll brighten Theplis. Quote, Grayson took it with a grin. He mounted his bicycle and pedaled off, leaving Miss Marple too. Her thoughts, she turned toward Rose Cottage, her steps low as she approached its gate. Lily was there, kneeling among the rose, her apron dusted with soil. She looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and offered a tentative smile. Miss Marple, she said, rising, come to see the blooms. They're holding on, despite everything. They're lovely, Miss Marple replied, peering at the rich red petals. You have a good hand with them, Lily. Mrs. Henshaw would be pleased. I think Lily's smile faltered, then steadied. I hope so, miss. It's strange working here without her, but couldn't let the garden go, not after all that's happened. Feels like keeping something alive, you know. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze soft. It's a kind thing to do. Gardens are like people, they need tending, even when they've been hurt. Lund loved roses, too, didn't she? Yes, Lily said, her voice dropping. She'd come by sometimes, just to look. Never said much, but you could tell they mean something to her. I wish I'd known what she was planning. Might have stopped here. Oh, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. You mustn't blame yourself. Felon's choices were her own, and Mrs. Henshaw's too. We can't always see Thethens until they pricked. Lily wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes distant. I suppose not, but I keep thinking about that ghost I saw, or thought I saw, me bite, was just her lurking about, restless. Silly, isn't it? Not silly at all, Miss Marple murmured. We see what we need to see sometimes, but it's past now. Ghosts are quiet, and the roses are yours to tend. They stood a moment longer, bigger dam, a silent bridge between them, until Miss Marple took her leave, her biscuit lighter by a few blooms she'd left with. Lily back home, she settled into her parlor, the afternoon sun slanting through the curtains. She thought of Grayson's were Lily's guilt, Ellen's envy, all small stitches in the fabric of St. Mary. Mean Mrs. Henshaw's trial loomed, but its outcome felt distant and not tied off beyond Thevelage's reach. As she picked up her knitting, her mandree turned to the scratch. Under Elon's floorboard, the circle with the line a marked no one could explain. It might have been nothing, a quirk of a restless hand, yet it lingered like a faint perfume. She smiled to herself, her needles clicking some threads she knew stayed loose. Not every mystery needed an answer, not every secret a key. The roses outside her window nodded in the breeze, their season nearing its end. Come spring, they'd bloom again, as with those at Rose Cottage, proof that life persisted even through shadow mist. Marple bent to her work, her hands steady, her heart at peace. The village was hers with all its flaws and graces, and she, its quiet guardian, never watchful, ever.